Good morning and welcome to today's session. Having spoken about the need to critically look at new writings produced in English in India, today we look at the different ways in which graphic novel can be approached from a critical point of view. Some of you might have paid attention to this news which appeared recently, where a graphic novel was in running for Man Booker Prize for the first time. The title of the novel was Sabrina. There were mixed responses to this, to the extent that some of them were arguing that a graphic novel cannot be considered as part of this genre, under this genre fiction. But nevertheless, the responses were also encouraging and promising. One of the news pieces from London read like this: a graphic novel has made the long list of the Man Booker Prize, Britain's most prestigious literary award. The nomination marks a major breakthrough for the format. Nick Drenasso's Sabrina, a work that Zadie Smith called the best book in any medium I have read about our current moment, is the surprise name among the 13 finalists announced today. So I would like to situate today's discussion on graphic novel in India within this context, about the newer formats coming in and challenging the conventions of storytelling, and also the formats within which stories were being conventionally told. And when one talks about a graphic novel, and when we try to approach it from a critical point of view, this is one of the questions that most of us face, whether this is literature or not, and what about the literary respectability and reputation of this genre or even subgenre. Before we go on to look at the different kinds of graphic novel which is currently in circulation in India, it's important to understand that this is different from comics. Graphic novel is not a comic book. Unlike a comic book, it's deeper, it depicts real life, and it targets a mature readership. Not to say that comics do not do those things at all, but this is the loose general definition that we would stick to while talking about graphic novel in today's lecture. You may not find too many books which look at graphic novel in a serious way. It's in that context that I place the significance of Pramod Nayar's recent work, The Indian Graphic Novel, Nation, History and Critique. As Nayar himself announces, this is a book that welcomes a graphic turn in Indian writing in English. He makes an attempt to theorize graphic novel and also to talk about graphic novel within the tradition of Indian writing in English. His most persistent argument being, this present book forwards a claim that the medium possesses enough formal and thematic complexities, not to mention the political edges, to deserve the same, if not more, sustained academic attention as traditional genres in Indian writing in English. And he also goes on to make this argument, this statement right at the outset of his book, that the Indian graphic novel possesses all the qualifications of a literary text. We do not therefore propose to engage in a debate about whether graphic novel is literary enough or not, whether we have enough within the space of graphic fiction to engage with it thematically, formally. Is it complex enough to deserve certain kinds of things that Pramod Nayar is bringing into this discussion, such as the nation, history and critique, which are part of traditional genres within Indian writing in English. While we are trying to be attentive to the growing readership and to the need for a sustained critique of graphic fiction in India, one also needs to be aware of the limitations in this process. There's only a small percentile of the population whom we can identify as a readership of a graphic fiction. This is unlike the Indian literature in vernacular, or even unlike the Indian writing in English. Some of those works, you would also realize, they're not very easily accessible. They target an elite readership. It is sophisticatedly produced and mostly expensively priced. This is something that Pramod Nayar also alerts us to when he enters this discussion on graphic fiction. There's a term that Nayar introduces us to when he is taking us through this discussion on graphic fiction: critical literacy. He argues that unlike the authoritative, definitive pedagogic histories of textbooks or official documentation, the graphic narrative tells us that there is no history outside modes of representation. So there is a serious way in which he encourages us to approach graphic fiction, and he says that this is something that an average Indian audience, an average Indian reader would find easier to do because of our literacy in the demotic register of the graphic narrative. And this, he says, can be exemplified in the Indians' exposure to a range of visual stimuli, whether it's Amar Chitrakatha or Chanda Mama series, or the Manmohan Desai films, and the kind of posters, the colorful posters that we were introduced to. So he Nayar at the outset argues that the average Indian is already exposed to a range of colorful visual stimuli. So it would be an easy transition to engage with graphic fiction because the critical literacy is already there. And he makes this powerful argument that there is no history outside modes of representation. And this we would also begin to notice when we look at some of the prominent works of recent times. These are some of the works that Nayar initially introduces us to. Hush, the author is Pratik Thomas, the illustrator is Rajiv Ive, and it is published by Mantare. You can notice that there are different figures, there are different kinds of author functions at work here. We have an author and also an illustrator. So it's certainly different from a conventional work of fiction. Hush is presented as a silent mini graphic novel. It's a slender volume. There are no words in it, only visuals, only pictures. It is the story of a schoolgirl who has been made a victim to child sex abuse. So this is also a work which has come out with the intention of creating awareness. Drawing the Line, Indian Women Fight Back is an anthology brought out by Zuban. It has a series of stories dealing with everyday discrimination and violence. And there was a lot of groundwork which went on behind the production of this work. It was conceptualized in response to Delhi 2012 gang rape case. It has about 14 graphic stories which engages with women's fights and women's struggles and their difficulties from different points of view. An Ideal Girl is one of the stories in this anthology, Drawing the Line, Indian Women Fight Back. It's by Soumya Menon, as you can see here. And this is how each of the illustrations featured. It's in different panels. Using Nayar's proposition that graphic fiction has enough metal, enough theme and enough complexity to merit a serious critical attention, I take you through a series of works which were produced in the contemporary. Some of the important works which would later perhaps be termed as a set of works which brought about this graphic movement, which gave momentum to this graphic fiction movement within the Indian context. A Gardener in the Wasteland, Jyotiba Phule's Fight for Liberty. It's a Navayana publication which came out in 2012. The story was by Srividya Natarajan and the art was by Abhirajita Nainen. And it graphically represents a less known story, a less narrated story of Jyotiba Phule. It's not a one of its kind work. We can find a lot of such works engaging with real history and trying to depict it visually, which is why Nayar also perhaps feels compelled to argue that there is no history outside the representation. Having noticed how graphic fiction actually deals with serious history, serious issues and complex political figures and ideology, it's important to look at the history and background of this newer genre which is now in vogue. Comics, if we notice, they have been in serious business in India since 1967 with the Amar Chitrakatha series. And graphic novel was a term coined only in 1964. It was in America by Will Eisner. But soon after that, we find Amar Chitrakatha series becoming a huge success in the Indian context. Though the term graphic fiction was not used to talk about Amar Chitrakatha, it was mostly seen as a comics. And this history and background can be found relevant in situating graphic fiction in the contemporary, and also it accentuates the need to critically approach and critically frame this genre, because we do share a history which dates back to the 1960s. Paul Gravett introduces this term progressive graphic novels to talk about the kind of works that we see today in the contemporary. Attempting to define them, Gravett points out they rely less on the corporate conveyor belt production system of editors, writers, pencilers, inkers and colorists and letterers. Instead, they are often the work and vision of a single complete auteur or a close partnership working as one. Being in control of every task brings a greater personality, directness and intimacy, as one person or a collaborative duo can put their thoughts and feelings into words and pictures. Among these progressive graphic novels, there are a series of titles that we can identify. Arijit Sen's River of Stories, which came out in 1994. It was published by Kalpavriksha. It's seen as a pioneering work. It engages with the impact of building the Sardar Sarovar Dam and the effect that it will have on the locals, the aftermath of it. Delhi Come is another one which focuses on this event of emergency. It is written by Vishwajyoti Ghosh. It's said about Delhi Come that it's part history lesson and part wake-up call to those too young to remember or have experienced this event of emergency. This is one of the illustrations from Delhi Come, which talks about the event of emergency which happened during 1975 to 77. There are a few works which thematically focus on urban India, just like some of the novels of contemporary Indian fiction also do. One of the leading works in this segment is Corridor by Sarnath Banerjee, and Sarnath Banerjee is considered as one of the leading graphic fiction artists and writers in India. In Corridor, he explores the city's fragmented realities and hidden lives, and this is being done through the life of a Delhi shopkeeper. The storyline follows his life and the incidents which happen to him. In that context, I would also like to remind you that Sarnath Banerjee is the one who identified his ideal reader as someone who is post-literate. I think we also need to read this in tandem, in connection with some of Nayar's observations, where he also talks about a critical literacy which the Indian already possesses because of his or her exposure to a range of visual stimuli, and also how Nayar situates the importance of graphic fiction as a kind of work which explicates that there is no history outside of representation. There's another work by Amruta Patil which was quite controversial and as part of an awareness raising campaign as well. It's titled Kari, and it talks about the lesbian community. Hyderabad, the graphic novel, is another important one which talks about the many changes that the city had gone through. It's a combined effort by J. Undurti and Harsho Mohan Chaturaj. It talks about the histories and fables that coexist in the contemporary and how they collectively inform the history of a city, in this case Hyderabad. And it also comes with this tagline that every city is a story. The nature of the histories and fables which are woven together, they span a period of almost 4 centuries. It also focuses on the emergence of Hyderabad as an IT hub. 2 books came out from the publishers Tara Books as experiments. One is Sita's Ramayana and the other one is I See the Promised Land. Sita's Ramayana was illustrated by Moina Chitraka and it was written by Samhita Aruni. I See the Promised Land was illustrated by Manu Chitrakar and it was based on a biography of Martin Luther King. And this is the experiment that they did. They used Patwa scroll artists for illustration, and they also tried cropping the hand painted panels in the artist's vertical scrolls and then rearranging them into pages of a book alongside the other usual typeset text. So there were these 2 different things coming together within this single book. It was done as an experiment, but it was not entirely successful because it was quite a challenge to bring in the native artistic traditions and the native practices and fuse them with the modern printing technology. But nevertheless, these need to be documented because these are the various things that the publishers are also willing to try out on an experimental basis. Opium Ayana Experiences of Untouchability is a book that Navayana published even before they brought out the graphic fiction on Jyotiba Phule. This was in 2011. It was written by Srividya Natarajan and S. Anand. The illustrations are particularly interesting. They were drawn by Durgabai and Subhash Vyam. They were Gond artists and they could make use of folk art traditions and convert them into illustrations for a graphic novel. So these are some of the different things that they tried to do. They have thought balloons which function as mind's eye. That's how it is illustrated. There are speech balloons shaped like birds, and whenever words of cruelty are uttered, because this is also in the context of the experiences of untouchability. So whenever words of cruelty are uttered, the balloon's tail transforms into a scorpion's sting. So this entire narrative, it's very visual. Even the illustrations, even the things which otherwise we do not pay attention to, such as a thought balloon, they are also illustrated to convey the emotion and to convey the overall theme that the this novel is talking about. Opium Ayana, as the title implies, is the biography of Ambedkar. It also tries to contextualize the plight of Dalits. So there is certainly a political edge in some of these works, as Pramod Nayar also tried to point out in his introduction to his seminal work. And this is the illustration that you can find in Opium Ayana, and it has received rave reviews. John Berger noted that it's an extraordinary book, a conference of corporeal experience across generations, full of pain and empathy. Arundhati Roy has remarked that it's unusually beautiful and unforgettable. So within the space of graphic fiction, Opium Ayana is one work which makes use of the freedom that the artist has. And if you ever get a chance to go through this illustrated work, it would be interesting to notice the different fonts that they use for various emotions. Due to technical reasons, we cannot share more illustrations from this book, but I strongly encourage you to take a look at this graphic fiction titled Opium Ayana to know about how they've made use of these various possibilities that this mode of illustration, that this mode of fiction is opening up before us. And this is also one such work which deals with the socio-political changes and also engaging with one of the powerful concepts and one of the powerful hierarchical elements in our society, namely caste and untouchability, which has been underrepresented in Indian fiction, we have noticed. And graphic fiction perhaps is one such avenue which would open up discussions and modes of representations for things such as caste or gender, which also suffers from a jaded kind of representation in the other spaces. Like the Zuban anthology, Drawing the Line, this is another anthology published by Yoda Press in 2013 titled This Side, That Side, Restoring Partition. It comprises of 28 stories where they talk about the need to access the story of partition. As the title implies, it's restoring partition. So the stories are about partition narrated by different individuals from various perspectives, and this is also a work which came out with the support of Goethe Institute. We do find the immense possibilities even in terms of the alliances that the publishers get into as far as this new genre is concerned. This lecture has not been able to cover all kinds of graphic fiction which is produced in the contemporary, but I hope I've given you some kind of a random sampling, a taste of how serious graphic fiction is also getting to be. But nevertheless, we need to agree and acknowledge that they continue to remain a niche market in the contemporary. It's also the kind of genre which requires heavy investment, and there are graphic fiction is selling well, but there are no best sellers yet. If we go by the statistics that is available in different online sources. There is also a dearth of more focused study to critique the aesthetics, the visual. I could come across only Pramod Nayar's work as a serious intervention in this in this context. And as I wind up this lecture, I would also like to draw your attention to one of the concepts that Nayar is introducing, rather Nayar is explicating in this study of graphic novels. He talks about the duality of narration and the possibility which this duality offers to us in terms of knowledge production and in terms of coming up with newer critical practices and establishing newer critical traditions. In Nayar's own words, it adds a new dimension to narrating events and contexts and conditions, the visual, so that multiple ways of telling are available on the same page, the documentary and the aesthetic, the satire, caricature and the traumatic realist. So this is perhaps the revolution which would set a different kind of ball rolling in the space of Indian fiction in English. There's a duality which does not mystify. It rather demystifies the many complex histories which have been part of not Indian fiction but this subcontinent itself. That's all we have for today. I thank you for listening and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.